Walter Cronkite once said, "In seeking the truth, you have to get both sides of the story." Coming to you live from the impact area of information and the destination of deliberate discussion. Welcome to Depth of Perspective, where the truth has no bias. With your host, Alex Kirsch. Information is our weapon, and we aim it on the azimuth of fire towards a better future for our country. Prepare yourselves for the arrival.
And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Depth of Perspective here in association with 365 Broadcasting. We are currently streaming live from Spreaker, but this video will be available on Facebook and YouTube. If you haven't done so, please hit follow and hit share this podcast out. Also, be sure to go like the Big Sarge Show podcast on Spreaker, run by Big Sarge himself, where he is always on target. Every Monday and Wednesday on Spreaker, and every Tuesday and Thursday on video, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Be sure to also catch Gary, a.k.a. G-Money, every Monday and Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on his show, No Bones About It. The show where we don't just train pets, we train humans as well. Every Saturday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, be sure to catch my entertainment podcast, Niner, not your normal entertainment review. Depth of Perspective is where the truth has no bias, and we evaluate every issue, both political and social, in the hopes of keeping the populace informed, but still leaving them with the ability to decide for themselves. This isn't any brainwashing hour. This is an hour of deliberate discussion where people of all political affiliations can come together and collaborate. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this party started. My guest tonight hails from Perth, Australia. He runs the podcast where you can hear on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Podbean, the Redline Fortnightly Deep Dive podcast. He has been involved in journalism since 2010 and has gone to work from countries ranging from Iran, Russia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, China, Belarus, and many more. He has appeared on over 150 radio stations around the world, speaking on various topics, and has performed and spoken in front of 10,000 plus people over the last decade. He is regularly called upon as an informed source for various publications and has won various awards for his work, and intends to continue through his duties in the show. He also works for various committees and think tanks in his home country of Australia, ranging from foreign policy through to Chinese electoral interference. He's always been happy to go wherever the story may take him, whether that has to be a war zone or a boardroom, to not only figure out the what, but also the why. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Depth Perspective. Michael Hilliard, how you doing today, Michael?
Not too bad. Yourself? How are you going?
Oh, I can't complain too much. I'm actually enjoying myself. So now that I've actually kind of given the intro, is there anything more you would like to actually share with the audience?
No, that intro is far too kind to me. So, yeah, I've been a journalist for a very long time, and I'm the host of the Redline podcast. So we do a deep dive each fortnight, and we deep dive into one big subject. So we're doing, like Libyan civil war or the Yemen civil war, or, Australia's Pacific strategy, or even, Transnistria, the breakaway Soviet Republic. So we do a big deep dive onto how, have three experts, whether it be, MI6, Harvard, Cambridge, CIA, State Department, university professors, just coming in to the experts of the experts to come in and talk about it and, inform us and get news from right there in the front.
Okay, excellent. So basically, like, we'll just kind of start this thing off. Like, the first thing I'd like to ask you, just to kind of let the audience know, where did you get the idea to start the Redline, the Fortnightly Deep Dive podcast? Like, what made you want to get into this industry? And, like, when did you actually start off on it?
So the thing I found the most is that a war zone always has the cheapest vodka. I always like a good cheap drink. And a lot of these war zones I traveled to over the years, both doing some writing for politicians or paid gigs for just writing. If a politician wants to sound smart, they'll often hire someone to write a book for them on a subject. So I took that role and I went out to war zones and whatnot. And then I got an offer from one of the news studios over here to do a kind of deep dive show, and I took on the opportunity, and it's been fantastic. Get to go and interview some amazingly smart people and try to act smart for a bit while they say smart things at me.
Okay, so when it comes down to it though, like why the Redline? Like, where did you get the idea to start? Why that? Is it just like a name? Just like, hey, it sounds like a catchy name or something like that. I mean, or is there any like real significance behind it?
So the red line comes from this concept of, in geopolitics, there's a lot of what you call red lines. So things that you won't cross. So for instance, and the NATO red line would be Russia pushing troops into the Baltics. That would be a red line that would force a response. And a lot of the times the red line is so set that everyone knows the rules of the game. And, you can cyber warfare me here and there, but you cannot cross this red line. And it was always, a really big part of geopolitics and a big part of thinking in that kind of structure is knowing where that red line is and going, well, we can do everything we can up to this point, and that's going to elicit a response from said country or this or this. We just can't cross that. And the red line was, let's take the show right up to the red line and even look at crossing it as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've actually heard like that term like used, especially like when it came down to the red line, like when President Obama was in office and he kept on drawing a different red line with Syria and like Russia interfering and stuff like that. So yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, I actually came up with a depth of perspective as an idea because like I like to look at like the main theme, like when the intro first starts up, it says Walter Cronkite once said, in seeking the truth, you have to look at both sides of the story, because I feel like there is no just one side to any story. There's two sides to every story. And I try to see it from both perspectives. And then I try to basically say, well, this is what I think about that based upon what I've learned so far. Because I feel like every story, there's always two sides to every story. And, that's just like how things go. But anyway, I actually listened to your episode about, I think it was in October, about Afghanistan. Having been in Afghanistan, I thought it was actually a very interesting topic. But the first one I listened to actually was about foreign aid, because that's one of my biggest topics when it comes to talking about foreign aid, because our countries contribute a lot of foreign aid to like all different countries from around the world. If I'm not mistaken, Australia contributes to New Guinea, Indonesia, Malaysia, all those other different countries. And I thought like one of the most interesting points that was made actually was the infrastructure within Australia isn't exactly top notch. I mean, that's just based upon what you had said. And I feel the same way for our country as well, that, infrastructure is not exactly at its peak, and we're like one of the largest superpowers in the world. But yet we contribute a lot of foreign aid to all different countries. Anytime people need assistance with something, we contribute, which it's not such a terrible thing. But at the same time, why aren't you taking care of your own citizens at the same time? Which I thought was a very interesting point that you made up. But at the same time, you also said is like, well, I think it was one of your guests, I can't remember which one it was, said that if we withdraw our foreign aid from, Malaysia or Indonesia or Fiji or New Guinea, guess who they're going to turn to next? The Chinese are then going to start contributing. Could you expound a little bit more upon that as to why they came to that?
So foreign aid, the best way I've ever heard it described to me is it is almost like an insurance policy. Right now we pay a little bit of money to Papua New Guinea in Australia's terms because we know that little bit of money prevents us having to pay a lot of money to remove the Chinese later. Or, we also pay, a lot of foreign aid actually goes to your own country. So for instance, a lot of foreign aid the US gives away, your two biggest countries you donate to are Pakistan and Mexico. Mexico, most of your foreign aid actually goes to fighting drugs and also building factories to then make US products. So for instance, most of your foreign aid to Mexico actually comes back, with a big investment. You make money on your foreign aid because the factories become cheaper and they can put stuff across, as well as the fact that if you can try and fight that drug war in Mexico, if you pull that aid, that drug war is going to move to, Arizona and Texas and New Mexico even more than it has. So it's kind of an insurance policy. It's, well, I'm going to pay $1 now because I know it's going to cost me $5 to defend this later if it's in my own country, because obviously your infrastructure is going to get hurt rather than Mexico's infrastructure. Pakistan is almost a bribe, and it's kind of that, I'm going to pay this to sit the way it is because if it goes wrong, it's going to cost me 10 times as much to go in and fix a government who is not sympathetic to US causes. So foreign aid is it's a very little amount of money for usually you get a very good investment back on it.
It is kind of a double-edged sword in a way, because like it's almost like you're kind of looking at it as like, this is like a no-win scenario right here. Like either we lose, or we lose because we don't contribute foreign aid, or we lose because, we are contributing foreign aid, but we're not taking care of our own populace. It does seem kind of like a double-edged sword, but at the same time, I think one of the most important points, like I said, that was made was the fact that, if China starts contributing foreign aid, the one thing that I can definitely say, based upon what I've learned about China, is that if they start contributing foreign aid, they're probably going to want something in return. And the only thing I can think of that they would want in return is battle space. That's the only thing that I can think of at the top of my head, is that they're looking at as a strategic place to put their, like some of their troops. And, maybe Fiji won't accept, and maybe New Guinea or Malaysia, but what if they do accept? I mean, I think that's one thing that they need to take into consideration, wouldn't you say?
Of course. Now, China is a very interesting one with their foreign aid. So they have this big initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative. So right now, China is in this weird position where all of its oil, most of its exports come through, and all its imports come in through the South China Sea. And the US just has such a gargantuan navy that it can just knock out anything. If the loggerheads came to it, the US Navy would beat them, no questions asked. The Belt and Road Initiative is designed to stranglehold most of their client states, but B, it's also designed to put a nice ring of bases that are not in the South China Sea. So, for instance, right now they're doing a pipeline deal with Pakistan, so they can get oil from all the way over in Pakistan rather than having to go all the way around down to India and through the South China Sea, which is laden with lots of little choke points. Yep. So, yeah.
So obviously China. Sorry?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. So yeah, it's all good. So China right now spends all its money on a few ways. So sometimes they use debt traps. So for instance, with Pakistan, what they did is gave the Pakistani government all the money it could want, because the Pakistani government was up for re-election and it went, well, I need to build some roads and railways and infrastructure. So they gave the Pakistani government a lot of money. And then they came back 10 years later and went, hey, we want that money back, knowing the Pakistanis could never pay for it. And the Pakistanis went, well, we don't have the money. Well, don't worry about the money. You have to give us Gwadar, which is the biggest deep water port Pakistan has. And now they have a 99 lease year on Gwadar, which is the biggest deep water port, which is outside the South China Sea. I mean, just in the last 3 years, if we're looking at China, 5 years ago, Xi Jinping goes up in a conference and says, I will not put bases outside of the Chinese territories. That's a US thing. We don't do that. But in the last 3 years, we've seen China expand from just on the Chinese territories to Tajikistan, to Malaysia, Tajikistan, technically Malaysia, Cambodia, Djibouti, Mozambique, and they are expanding quickly. The Chinese are now getting positions to be able to project power into areas they couldn't. To any analyst who thought the Chinese could project into the Middle East, 10 years ago we'd be laughing at you, but now from Djibouti we can project into the Gulf of Aden, as well as North Africa and the Middle East with some relative ease.
It's kind of a scary thought to think about, considering it kind of goes back into that, is this a win-win scenario or is this a lose-lose scenario? Yes, we can rebuild the infrastructure, but the thing is, China has spent the last 10, 15 years kind of essentially continuing to rebuild. However, they still have a large population of homeless people living in squalor, but yet China is still building. It's still building its infrastructure. It's building its, the technology. Because we use China for a lot of their products. Like every item that you can come across here in the United States, you look at it, it's either made in Taiwan, Indonesia, or made in China, essentially. So we put a lot of business into China. And the thing is, they're continuing to spread their influence right there. And so you got to kind of think about it. It's okay, so what do we have to lose from this? What do we have to gain if we pull all aid from these certain countries and China takes advantage of it? It's kind of a scary situation if you think about it.
So again, it comes down to that insurance policy. It's like if you have a crack in your house, it's always cheaper to pay to fix the crack than it is to let it get so big that it ends up caving the roof in. So with China, a lot of these guys we're paying them to be our friends because we know that the opposite would be much harder to get China away. So for instance, the US withdrew a lot of aid and support from the Philippines recently, and now the Philippines, particularly under the Duterte administration, is more or less going towards China. I mean, they put a statement out just a few months ago saying they would almost look at ceasing US operations or joint operations with the US, which they won't. I don't think they will. But it definitely signals, give us some money or we're going to go to Beijing. And then to lose the Philippines is a huge part of the US South China Sea strategy. It's that, if we go back to World War II, you don't want to island hop all the way back from Bougainville and Guadalcanal. You want to kind of start at the Philippines and go from there, if war was to break out. So it's that, do you want to keep a little bit of money there and make sure they're friends and that you give them cheap exports and they buy stuff off you and they're a client state? Or later on, if war does break out, your starting point isn't the Philippines, it's Hawaii, and then you've got to fight and lose American soldiers, boom, 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 all the way across. And it's an insurance policy going, well, a little bit of money now, we don't have to go fight through Papua New Guinea and Bougainville and Fiji and Samoa later on.
Well, it's not just about us being located in the Philippines. I mean, we've also got troops that are located in South Korea. You've got soldiers that are located in Japan. I mean, you got soldiers located in Guam. Now, people might think that Guam isn't that important, but the thing is, though, is that Guam is actually like a very ideal location. Why? Because you can meet your halfway point and refuel all your jets, all your boats, or whatever you got there. It's a very good strategic location. It's not very big, but the thing at the same time, it's not the size of the island that matters. It's what you can do with that island is what makes it so important. I mean, and that's the thing that people don't really take into account. I mean, if you lose the Pacific to China, they're going to control that entire region, and that's a massive piece of real estate to own, if you ask me.
Of course, Guam is incredibly important to the U.S. strategic position for a number of reasons. A, it's a lovely radar base, and Guam means you can go and look at Russian submarines and Chinese submarines in the South Pacific. B, it works as a missile base if you want to launch missiles. C, it's an unsinkable aircraft carrier. The Chinese can bomb it all they want. You can still land planes on it, and there's a couple of spots to land planes on it, which is very different to Kiribati and some of these guys have only got one airstrip. And D, it's a great refueling station. I mean, most of the Indian Ocean operations through the Malacca Strait, operations through the South China Sea are usually refueled or refitted in Guam. It's a particularly great little territory for the US because it allows you to project power. China thinks, you think twice when there's a battle group that can be from Guam to the South China Sea in a mere couple of days. And that would make your decisions, much different to, the US right now has strategic depth. So they knew that if, let's say, the Chinese were going to steam aircraft carriers towards Los Angeles, it would be days and days and days warning. Whereas if you're steaming from Guam to Hainan or Guangzhou or anywhere down there, it's only going to be a couple of days.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I mean, let's just say, for example, you're in charge down there in Australia. You're like, was it the president or the prime minister of Australia? Like, how's that go? I'm sorry, I'm kind of drawing a blank on that.
It's a prime minister here. We still technically have the Queen as our head of state. It's very weird.
Gotcha. Okay, you're the prime minister of Australia, and you're brought with a situation where you either have to choose to continue to give foreign aid, or do you just cut them off and say, hey, you're on your own? I mean, what would you do in that scenario?
I would almost increase foreign aid, because from foreign aid, it's one of the only bits of our budget that it makes more money than it gives. So particularly things like, I know the foreign aid that we gave to Thailand was not because we were feeding needy Thai children. It was because we were paying for Thailand to build roads from the rubber plantations to the port. So then we cut our costs down from this single dirt track to this double lane highway where we can now truck twice as much rubber to the port, and that makes cheap rubber for Australia. A lot of our foreign aid is like that. Particularly, it might be, we're going to pay you a bit of money to start up a mine, and then we get exclusive mining rights to that mine later on. Some of them is almost bribe money, but then again, what it does is force those countries to buy things from Australia. So for instance, we give a lot of money to Fiji, but now Fiji is so dependent on Australia and Australian foreign policy that they use the Australian dollar as their currency. So Fiji has paid us back almost as much as we've given them, as well as having a big strategic partner that helps us project into the Pacific and make sure that China would have to take Fiji first to be able to take Australia, or we'd base short-range aircraft and things out there to project into the Pacific. So it has been a good use of our money. As much as people think that we should be spending on infrastructure and stuff, it's such a small part of the budget. So for Australia particularly, it's 0.22% of our budget, which is almost nothing. For the Americans, it's 0.05% of your budget overall. And the biggest recipient of foreign aid for you guys is, in weapons-wise, is Israel. But Mexico and Pakistan are the two big ones. Pakistan, you guys are starting to do a lot of manufacturing. But Mexico is one of your biggest trading partners. And every dollar you've spent has kept the war away from you, as well as the fact that it allowed Mexico to build lots of factories, which then made American goods cheaper, which the savings are then passed to the American consumer. Obviously, there are economists who talk more about this than I am, but if I was in charge of Australia, I would probably advocate for a more healthy, robust foreign aid policy. Not for charity, but for, to help the country.
Absolutely. Those are all actually really solid points. And, it's good to know, because some people don't actually look at it that way. Instead, they just look at it as like, oh, we're not taking care of our own country. But at the same time, you're like, well, actually, we're trying to take care of the country, but we're also trying to make sure that we maintain this relationship with these other countries, because that's the biggest part about diplomacy right there. One of my biggest lessons when it comes down to diplomacy is everyone thinks that diplomacy just extends to overseas, but it doesn't. you also have to be diplomatic within within your own country, that's a whole nother topic and a whole nother show for all of us. But you see where I'm coming from in that regard, right? Like how you have to maintain relations and ensure people understand why you're making these decisions, because a lot of these decisions that are made by our leaders are some really difficult ones, and people just don't get the whole story as to why we do what we do. I mean, I think people need to be more educated. What do you think?
I fully agree. And a lot of the time, the world of geopolitics is such a delicate balance game. There are so many times where you might help, something like the Yemeni civil war, which everyone just ignores because it's this backwater of Yemen. The fate of the Yemeni civil war is control of 85% of the world's oil reserves. Not because it's where the oil is, but because it sits right at the two biggest oil choke points of the world, the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of the Bab el-Mandeb. Effectively, if that war was unchecked, that puts a giant button that anyone can push to end 85% of the world's oil trade, particularly for Europe and the West. And that would make the West, if let's say that was to happen, European oil would collapse very, very quickly. The economy would collapse, and it comes back and bites the US really, really, really badly. It's a little bit of money now for a big payoff to make, to guarantee that everything stays the way it should. It's very much an insurance policy.
And there's a lot going on in the Strait of Hormuz right now. I've looked into like what goes on there. It's like they talk about how the Iranians are a problem, but if I'm not mistaken, it's not just like the Iranians you got to worry about. You got to worry about pirates in that region too, because the Strait of Hormuz and the Malacca Strait, which if I'm not mistaken, is some of the most dangerous.
Yeah, the Malacca Strait is between Indonesia and Malaysia, but it's very small.
There's a lot of pirates.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of pirates, but the thing that people don't realize is it's the insurance that will kill you. So, for instance, Australia pays military aid to Indonesia, even though military they're a competitor with us. We give Indonesia military aid in the form of short-range helicopters and anti-piracy stuff because it's essential for Australia. All our oil and petrol comes through Indonesian waters, and it comes through little gaps where you could put, let's say, an anti-ship missile or a couple of pirates on the, in the jungle here and fire at a ship and sink it. Now, a ship going down isn't the end of the world, but what the insurance company will do is go, well, it's very expensive, and doubles the insurance, which that cost then gets passed down to the consumer, so myself being in Australia, and that would double the price of everything, and that would put a huge wrench in our economy. So a lot of these times when you think, oh, it's just piracy and we just got to stop the pirates, a lot of it is making sure that those pirates don't get anywhere near it to make sure the insurance stays low and that cost isn't passed to the consumer. So a lot of time, again, it's just I'm talking so much about insurance here, but yes, it's making sure that doesn't happen.
We got to think about the cargo that they're carrying. Like, for example, like in the Horn of Africa, where they're doing a lot of pirates are known there. What usually goes to the Horn of Africa? Aid, like medical supplies, things like that. Medical supplies are very, 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 they're great. I mean, they can be sold for a crap ton on the black market. So just think about the profit that the pirates will make. I mean, granted, they might get like a small cut of it, but the thing is, though, it's going to contribute to the black market so much. But, kind of before we go into that topic, we're going to go ahead and take a 3.5 minute break, folks. We'll be right back after 3.5 minutes. So take this time to top off on your beverages or go use the bathroom, whatever you have to do. We'll be back after 3.5 minutes.
1 second. 1 second is all it takes. Your life can change in 1 second, the news can change in 1 second, and the world can change in 1 second. We live in a world where disinformation gets thrown about like it's just another day, where fake news is the new norm, and you can't trust the mainstream media. So what do? Where do you go? And who do you listen to? Where can you find the truth? Downrange with Sarge is where you should aim your sights. Sarge delivers a no-nonsense kind of show that shoots to you straight. This is a show that delivers on facts and aims to give you the truth. You can catch us on Spreaker Mondays and Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and on Facebook Tuesdays and Thursdays at the same time. Downrange with Sarge, always on target.
The media was meant to be the fourth branch of government, to always tell what's factual, not what sells faster. Where the media was meant to be unbiased and keep the populace informed on what's going on in the world. Nowadays, you have to ask yourself, what the hell happened? coming at you live every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Spreaker. Be sure to catch Alex Will, host of Depth of Perspective, where the truth has no bias. Every topic of today, whether it be political or social, will be discussed. Guests and opinions are always welcome. Prepare yourself for real life.
Welcome to No Bones About It, in conjunction with 365 Broadcasting. Be sure to hit that follow button and share this show out. Do you have a dog behavioral problem? How about a question about a specific dog breed? Well, on No Bones About It, we cover it all. We go over basic training methods to advanced behavioral problems. Have a favorite breed? Want to know its history? Your host Gary can tell you everything you want to know. You are listening to No Bones About It, where we don't just train dogs, we train humans.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Hopefully everyone enjoyed their break right there right quick. And once again, if you haven't done so, please go ahead and hit like and hit share. And be sure to share out this podcast, and be sure to tune in to Michael Hilliard's podcast, The Redline. I actually enjoy listening to the show. I think it's got a lot of good topics he talks about. Before we went into the break, I talked very briefly about like the amount of money that pirates can make on, like, for example, when they take a freight that's taken medical aid into Somalia, for example, and Somali pirates have come around to the Horn of Africa and whatnot. I mean, the thing is, it's really hard to predict when they come out and about. So the thing is, like, the insurance companies of these maritime deliveries, it's hard for them to take into consideration how are they going to protect their payload. I mean, I know we're kind of getting a little bit off topic, but what are some things you think that they could do better as far as like combating against these pirates and whatnot, whether it's the Horn of Africa or the Strait of Hormuz or the Malacca Strait?
So the piracy problem is much better than what it was, a few years ago. People have got a lot of more anti-piracy measures, and piracy is being taken very seriously. In fact, NATO has an anti-piracy fleet stationed in Djibouti at most times. The thing they go after most is LNG ships, so liquid natural fired gas, and they're mostly going in not to take the gas for themselves, but to ransom it back. So they'll take, if their aim is usually take the ship, take the captain, hey, I want $100,000 wired into account, and we'll give you the ship back. And a lot of times that back in the day, particularly, they used to just, LNG companies will weigh up and go, well, it's going to cost our insurance this much extra. Let's just pay them $100,000 and they'll leave us alone. And, we just write it off as a expense almost. These days we're a lot better. They can track these ships a lot quicker now. And they've got a lot of patrol boats. The US has been the particular heavy lifter on that one. The Italians as well. The British have got some stuff in there. But mostly Djibouti now is anti-piracy stuff to curb Somalia. There have been some good programs there to try and, again, using a little bit of foreign aid money, try and give Somalian fishermen, let's say what the aim has been to, let's say, give them fishing nets so they can fish and give their family some food and money that way, rather than having to resort to piracy because of the fact that there's just no jobs in the village. It's bad, and it gets worse, in certain seasons than other seasons. But piracy numbers are way down because a lot of the ships that are in there, A, can go faster than a lot of these pirate ships can. B, a lot of the time now have armed guards aboard who will fire upon them, and they know that. And C, that as soon as they can track the boats coming in on the radar, the US version of the Coast Guard from Djibouti will scramble pretty quick. And as soon as they see a US naval ship, they're not even going to try anything because they know that it would just be forfeit for their lives. It's an interesting problem, but we are getting better at it. What we're more worried about is, let's say, coming through the Strait of Hormuz, if you come through Malacca, if you've ever been through there, or if you come through some of these Indonesian straits where it is shipping, is very, very small gaps. You can see from one side of the Strait of Malacca to the other, and it's just full of boats at all times. It would take a couple of anti-ship missiles to effectively sink one of these things. And that's where you see problems. If people are too scared to go through the Strait of Malacca, then you're going to see some serious costs go up because they'll either have to go right around Indonesia or they'll have to up the insurance costs.
Okay. Yeah. it's good to hear that they're doing more about it, but it's it's some of those things you really can't predict, but it's out there. I mean, it's just kind of like
Of course.
like the threats of terrorism. The threat's out there. You just don't know where or when it's going to hit you. Moving on, though, I was going to talk about another issue, but I think that this one's actually a bit more issue. What do you think is like the biggest issue concerning Australia today? Because I know that we just talked about earlier about how they finally got the fires contained, and you said I think it was like the size of the fire was like the country of Ireland and whatnot, which is, a lot of wildlife has essentially been extinguished, and now there's a lot of wildlife from Australia that are now even considered on the endangered species list. And there are those out there that think, oh, that's not that big of a deal, when actually, me being you could say I'm kind of an environmentalist, and I also happen to be an animal lover, but at the same time, anytime one animal is erased from this ecosystem, it has a dramatic impact on the ecosystem for that region, essentially. So, but kind of going back to the question, what do you think is one of the biggest issues that's facing in Australia today?
Australia has a number of key issues. So first of all, the climate is a big problem over here. The bushfires are getting worse. The droughts are getting longer. In 1 week, 3 weeks ago, we had flooding, we had fires, we had hail, we had snow, and we had the bushfires raging again more aggressively. And then 2 days later, hail in the same place. We are, when seasons change, they change very dramatically here. I mean, myself, I'm sitting here, it's 11 o'clock at night here in Australia, and it's still 36 degrees, which I think is about 94 Fahrenheit, if memory serves. But Australia's biggest doctrinal issue is the fact that we are stuck between a rock and a hard place economically and militarily. Our entire, I sit on a lot of foreign policy councils, and, we buy so much of our stuff from China. China is our biggest customer, and they buy most of our stuff, particularly our minerals and our steel and gas and uranium and everything China buys. But our biggest military partner is the US. And we know that if war was to break out between you guys, we would be the biggest losers, because if we side with China, we have that economic partner who will keep buying stuff from us in the time of war. They'll probably buy more stuff, but with the US naval power the way it is, they'll cut the South China Sea, they'll cut the Strait of Malacca, they'll cut the Indonesian archipelago. Boom, we can't get anything in, and we can't get anything out. And Australia is the only developed nation that has a fuel supply of less than 2 weeks. In fact, this country's fuel reserve is 13 days. So if you guys in the US Navy was to say, nope, you've sided with China, too bad, you would cut our shipping lanes, and then we would have no fuel in less than 2 weeks, which is insane for a developed nation. Whereas the US are...
Yeah. No, go ahead.
So the US are our natural ally. Culturally, we're much closer to the US, but we're very similar culturally to the US. They will protect our shipping lanes, and we do have the ANZUS Treaty with you guys, which is a treaty between the US, Australia, and New Zealand. And that's why we just, as soon as the US go to war, we follow them straight away. We've gone to Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Even in the tension recently in the Strait of Hormuz, Australia was one of the first to send a frigate out there to go, yep, no, we're on your side. We'll go to war with Iran if we need to. So that's the big doctrinal problem for Australia. That if war breaks out, of course we'll side with the US, because that's who our allies are. But then it rips like 60-something% of our economy out overnight, which will just collapse our economy. So we will be, the whole country will be broken, and we won't be able to do anything, and it will be, going back to the 50s for us. But that's the only choice we have, because the alternative is you cutting our shipping lanes. So that's the biggest thing I think it hits Australia, is the fact that we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. And we just hope to God that the US and China don't go to war, because the biggest loser of that will be...
You expound upon you would go back to the 1950s. What you mean by that, for those that maybe aren't aware about what you're talking about?
Sorry about that. So in the 1950s, Australia was effectively the backwater of Asia. The Australian dollar was not even a thing yet. We were still on the pound, and it was just terrible. We were kind of the same way you would view. I'm trying to think of a good example, but some backwater of Europe that you don't really think about. We were kind of the Moldova of the southeast. And that was the trouble. We didn't manufacture too much. We were too reliant. We were a very agricultural society. And it wasn't till we had the 60s, 70s and started to get our act together, and we started to really become a good service industry. We started to manufacture a bit more, and we also started to, develop great technology and put a lot of money into R&D and put us at the forefront of that things that we became a really developed nation. We were also the first of the developed nations to reach out to China and started a good trade deal with them when it was still Mao. In fact, we beat you guys to meeting with China. Gough Whitlam, our prime minister, did by a few years before Nixon did. So that's, if Australia was to cut all our ties internationally, we don't have any rubber facilities in this country anymore. We don't have many fuel. We don't have any fuel reserves. Even some of our towns are almost out of water as is. And we make a lot of gas and a lot of steel and whatnot, but we just don't have a lot of the consumable goods, that we come to expect. I mean, even now, I sat in a foreign policy meeting the other day, and they were saying there's a serious crisis on small electronics. So doorbells, and doorknobs, just little weird knick-knacky things because of the coronavirus, because none of the factories are outputting as much as they are. And because of it, in about 5 months' time, there's going to be a big shortage in small electronics in this country. And that's just how reliant we are on imports now, because we've moved further away from our manufacturing sector and towards buying international stuff.
It's kind of crazy how you think like something so insignificant as a doorknob would actually like have that much of an impact, all because of like one little event. I mean, the coronavirus is a very interesting concept because there are people that, I think they've got like tens of thousands of cases right now in China alone, and thousands of people, haven't like a couple thousand people died already from the coronavirus?
The death toll is still fairly low, and the death toll below the age of 30 is very, very low. I mean, it's an interesting conundrum for the Chinese because the death toll is, the kill rate of a coronavirus is lower than the regular flu, but it's a little more contagious than the regular flu is, and we don't know how it will mutate yet. So the World Health Organization hasn't given that stipulation going, this is the final form, you're fine. We don't know where it will go. And also the Chinese are if you remember going back to the sort of beginning of the millennium where we had the SARS epidemic, the Chinese covered it all up and they didn't talk about it. And then when it came and revealed itself to the world and it was huge and much bigger and worse than we thought it was, the Chinese got the ire of the entire international community going, why would you cover it up? What are you doing? What are you doing? Now I think the Chinese are trying to be as open as they possibly can about this thing to try and show, look, we're a developed nation. We're trying to get there. We're being as open as we can. We're not doing SARS. We're not trying to muck around with this again. But we don't know the final form of this thing. So far, it's only really taking out people with damaged immune systems already, or they're very old, or they're very sick, which in China, a damaged immune system is much more common because the air pressure and air pollution is far worse. I spent some time in Beijing, and I can tell you that, 4 days into my trip to Beijing, I was coughing up black liquid into my hand. It's a day in Beijing is the same as 40 cigarettes, effectively. So most people in industrialized Chinese towns, in example Wuhan, have much more degraded lungs than you'd find in someone in Minneapolis or Sydney would have less degraded lungs. The economic impact of coronavirus will be much worse because none of the factories are outputting. So, for instance, the next year's iPhone is already being looked at as a problem, or this year's iPhone, sorry, is already being looked at as a problem because a lot of the components to that are not being built at the moment. So there's a problem in the supply chain, which we don't feel now, but we'll feel in about 5 months.
Well, kind of going into it, I mean, the thing is, I'm not really one of those conspiracy theory kind of guys, but the thing is, there's something that just doesn't really sit well with me as far as the coronavirus is concerned, right? Like, you see people on TV that are getting snatched up saying, you have the coronavirus. Part of me is thinking is like, what if these people really aren't infected? What if these people are just, selected to be, hosts or something like that? I mean, I know that's a bit far out there, but it wouldn't be the first time you hear of a government that's actually using its own people to test the lethality of a virus or to test like the cure of the virus and whatnot, because what we see on television isn't always 100% true. Why? Because, obviously China's not going to push out saying people are being snatched up in the streets and being sent and given the coronavirus. But however, something just seems a little, skewed about this. I mean, am I just a little bit too far thinking out there that this is actually possible?
So it's a difficult one. We'll never know. The Chinese government is notoriously quiet on what they do with their stuff. If they were to test viruses, I think they'd probably do it on their prisoners from Xinjiang in the west of the country, the Muslim Uyghur population out there, which they have been caught testing medical practices on a number of occasions from escapees and guard testimonials saying that they have been testing medical supplies, they've been testing out all sorts of things on the camps out there. To do it in Wuhan would be a bit weird for China because Wuhan is such a centralized, the way China kind of works in that region is everything goes to Wuhan and then kind of goes out from there. It's very much like Moscow works for the Russians. So to test it in a very big transportation hub feels a bit like shooting yourself in the foot. I mean, it's already put a big dent in China's economy. In a time where they're in this trade war, they want to look as strong as they can. I don't see why they would test it in Wuhan. I could definitely see them testing it in Xinjiang. But Wuhan testing on their own citizens, it would either be an experiment that went wrong, but then again, I've been to one of these wet markets, as they call them, where they serve bat and armadillo and koala and crocodile and rat meat, all in the same place and all very unhygienic. And I can definitely see how a virus like this would break out. I mean, the last WHO person I spoke to was indicating it was a pangolin strain of the coronavirus that was mixed with dog and rat meat. And I can definitely see how a thing would break out there in a wet market.
Yeah, I haven't really looked too much into it because I just keep hearing about it. But it's just like when it comes to the scientific stuff, I'm just like, let's just say I'm not very well rehearsed in that field. But
neither am I. It's why I ask experts. That's why I go ask other experts because I don't know this either. So I just ask other people.
Good though. I mean, it's good to go after people that actually know what they're talking about in this regard. Let's kind of talk about like as far as the world is concerned, okay? And this could be anybody. No answer is the wrong answer, in my opinion. I'll just ask you about it. So, as far as the world is concerned, who do you think is the biggest threat right now in the world? It doesn't have to. It could be like economically, or biggest threat in the terrorism spectrum, or who do you think is the biggest threat that if they decided to just attack everybody, they would cause an absolute, disaster for the entire world? Like the entire world would just feel the impact of it at this point if they just went absolutely. If they just started going scorched earth, essentially. Who do you think that country would be?
So I think there's a few big threats. There are a few people in this world who would get the most bang for their buck. So, for instance, someone like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia could definitely do some damage by, going and ending oil exports. It would destroy his economy as well, but that would cause problems. The Ayatollah in Iran has a lot of cards up his sleeves to close the Strait of Hormuz as well as use rockets against Saudi Arabian facilities, which would cause problems for the US economy. Putin has a lot of influence it has a lot of influence in Europe at the moment and has the ability, if he really, really pushed for it, to do some real damage to European economies. And the way that we're globalized, it would cause problems. Obviously, there's members of the US administration who are a little bit gun happy for my liking, but there's so many people who could do a lot of damage. I think Rupert Murdoch, he has such a large media impact. He could definitely lead some stuff down the way. There's obviously the conspiratorial aspect. There's some of the very, very rich billionaire people can definitely push their influence on certain things. There are certain members of the WHO who can do it. Frankly, there's terrorists out there holding nuclear weapons, that could definitely do some incredible damage. The thing that I worry about most is Modi and Imran Khan in India and Pakistan. I think they're probably the if I were a betting man, I'd say that if the world was to end, it would be caused there more than anywhere else. But I think there's lots of people who can do a lot of damage, but it's whether they want to or not.
Yeah, if I was to have to be a betting man myself, actually, I would have to say like the two countries we should be the most concerned about would be like Iran, I think, and I would also have to say China. And it's just the reason I say Iran is because they are essentially the epicenter for a lot of terrorism. Now, I could also say Saudi Arabia because there's a lot of Wahhabism that comes out of that country, and it's also got Mecca, which everybody flocks to, for their Hajj essentially. And the thing is, Iran has great influence. They were actually teaching a lot of insurgents how to fight U.S. troops in Iraq, and some people would come to their country to learn more about their different methods in which to fight American soldiers and whatnot. And I think that they could definitely be a huge threat, especially to us. I know there's been talk about them enriching uranium to basically create nuclear warheads. Now, I haven't done enough research about the whole Iran bit as to whether they are developing, because they insist that they're building nuclear reactors so that way it could be find a way for sustainment of power and whatnot. I don't know. I haven't really gone into it. I mean, you'd probably know more about that than I do. which I'll ask you about in a second. But the reason I say China is because they have the economic means, they have the reach, they have the Navy, they have one of the largest militaries in the world. Now, people would say, well, numbers don't mean a whole lot. Well, actually, they actually can, because it's an old principle of Sun Tzu from The Art of War. It's like, if you can defeat an enemy just by sheer numbers, by sheer mass, without losing anybody, then you've truly won the war. And that can actually have a huge psychological impact upon the troops, especially if it's an opposing force. And I'm not going to put it past China to actually want to continue to extend their reach all across Asia, whether it's Southeast Asia or, stretching further west, actually, because they just have that growth. They have that power. They have that impact. And essentially what they're doing in their own country, like, for example, they're snatching people that happen to be Muslim, if I'm not mistaken, and throwing them into conversion camps and whatnot. And no one seems to be doing a whole lot about that.
So yeah, let's talk about Iran. We'll talk about China, and I'll try and put your mind at ease a bit. So Iran is not as dangerous as they think it is. I spent a bit of time in Iran myself. They're quite lovely when you get to the ground there. But Iran does not have the capability to go outside of Iraq. Right now their entire defense force, or the Iranian defense force, is designed for defensive operations to really fight in the mountains and bleed an attacker dry. It's what we saw in the Iran-Iraq war, and even the white papers released by the Ministry of Defense are all indicating that the plan would be that if the US were to be foolhardy enough to go in there, they would rocket the shit out of every US tank, knowing that every rocket they fire costs $70,000, but it takes out a $1.4 million tank. The Iranians have this concept, and they keep talking about it, is the nuclear war deterrent. Right now, if they are, the deal's off the table, so they're going to go for the nuclear weapon because the Ayatollah looks at North Korea, who has nuclear weapons, and they're treated very seriously. Trump sits on the stage with Kim Jong-un as equals. You don't mess with the North Koreans because they have nukes. You don't want Seoul to be nuked, so you play nice and you have to talk to them like it's adult to adult. Whereas Libya, for instance, Gaddafi gave up his nuclear ambitions, and the US supported the rebels to take him and string him up and kill him. Saddam was exactly the same. Saddam gave up his nuclear ambitions, and the US supported a attack to go in and take Saddam out and kill him. So I think Iran kind of looking at it and going, well, nuclear weapons is probably the only thing that would stop America just crossing and actually, it would make the US think twice. It's an insurance policy, and getting back to that phrase. So that's the only reason they build a nuclear weapon. They know that the moment they launch one, even if, let's say, they get to the level of a Dandong 5, which is not that great, and they wouldn't even hit Israel if they could. But let's say, for the sake of the argument, they get one and they attack some US frigate in the Strait of Hormuz. They know that the retribution would just be devastating. It's not worth for the Iranians to take out one small US boat to lose Tehran and Shiraz and all these amazing cities. It's not a deal they want to make. They just want to make sure they don't get invaded, and they're looking at North Korea and going, I think nukes is the only reason they're not. I don't know if that's true, but that's what Iranian generals and Iranian journalists keep telling me, is that's their reasoning. That's what's in their head, going, a nuke would stop the Americans even thinking about invading us. They have the Strait of Hormuz. I don't think they need to, but that's a whole other thing. China there's a very big difference between taking and holding ground. So China has a lot of troops and a lot of artillery and a lot of tanks, but where are they going to invade? I mean, they tried invading Vietnam themselves in the 70s, and it was a calamity for them. They can't go in. The Burmese government is already sympathetic to them. The Indians are almost impossible to get to because they've got to cross the Himalayas, and getting tanks across is too hard. Pakistan is already a very sympathetic Chinese ally. Afghanistan is a bunch of nonsense. Tajikistan is effectively a Russian/Chinese puppet anyway. Kyrgyzstan is the Russian backyard. Kazakhstan is the Russian backyard. Mongolia is Mongolia. The Chinese already own it politically anyway. So there's not really anywhere for China to expand militarily apart from starting bases in places like Djibouti and Cambodia and those sort of places. To get to the US, for instance, would be nightmarish because being an army soldier yourself, you know how quickly you burn through your rations and you burn through ammunition. I know the doctrine for Australia is that we don't fight the Chinese as they land on the shores. we're going to wait, we're going to let them land on the shores, and then we're going to bomb all their supply boats and all their supply ships. So the men on the ground just run out of bullets because they're just stuck in the desert with nothing to fire. And it's far easier to fight them that way. And the Chinese don't have a particularly good air transport fleet. They don't have a particularly good supply fleet. And they would need to have a base in, let's say, Papua New Guinea or Bougainville or even Indonesia to be even able to attempt Australia, let alone trying to get across the Pacific against the biggest navy and biggest air force. So I think China has a very big military and can definitely, pump itself muscles up, but I don't see it being being able to attack anyone that would really make too much of a difference. In fact, a lot of their new purchase of vehicles is designed for crowd control. China is ready to invade a province if someone was to act up far quicker than they are to, let's say, invade India or Pakistan.
Well, here's the interesting thing about that. Do you read like a lot of books and whatnot? I'm talking about fiction books.
No, I mostly read nonfiction. I'm a very boring person.
Well, okay, so the thing is like there's an author out there by the name of Brad Thor. I'm a huge fan of his, and I've been meaning to try to talk to him. Well, he actually wrote a book about is like one character, and he's basically like today's version of Tom Clancy, essentially, right? And the Chinese, in one of his books, actually developed a entire technique, and apparently this is like a real deal. So if you want to look into it, it's called unrestricted warfare, where China essentially states that war against the United States is inevitable. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. So they started developing a plan where why would you attack? Because they know they can't defeat the United States force on force, because the United States has been at war and its 250-year history. It's been only like 16 years of peace, essentially, right? So they've essentially been at war this entire time. China realizes, why would you attack its enemy where he's strongest and not attack him where he is weakest? And essentially this plan of unrestricted warfare is they created their own Islamic terror network, right? And then they would just like launch attacks all over certain parts, like attack our European allies, and then attack the United States, as talk all the soft spots that really make people just frightened, because then they'll turn to any answer, essentially. And it comes down to the point where they just take out our entire infrastructure by targeting certain locations. So the thing is, though, is like, if you think about it, China has a very long history of being brilliant tacticians when it comes to war. Now, granted, they haven't really reached out and touched anybody lately, but the thing is, who's to say they're not doing that right now? Who's to say they're not going to try to find different ways? Because there's people called Chinese hackers that are able to, and especially Russian hackers, that have found ways to like hack into power stations and shut off the power. I mean, just one power station that could take out an entire county would cause absolute mass pandemonium. So who's to say that they're not able to do something like that? I mean, if you cause enough disruption in a country and then invade, the entire country is going to be in disarray already. So that's one of the things that I've always found interesting about that. I mean, what do you think?
So that is a huge problem. I mean, this is something that, obviously there's some classified things I can't talk about, but one of the major issues we're all coming up against is cyber warfare. It is the new front and no one knows how to deal with it. So a scenario that we were batting around is, let's say for the sake of the argument, because cyber warfare is real. Like, for instance, the way the US destroyed the Iranian centrifuges last time before the deal happened is we hacked into the Iranian systems and then got the turbines to spin too fast. So the turbines broke themselves and exploded and destroyed the machines themselves. The Americans hacked in and the Americans did that, and it got rid of the centrifuges. Cyber warfare is here and it's real. And a scenario that we were playing that was being played out was, let's say if you take a swing state, because they're particularly important in election years, like Pennsylvania, for instance, and you were to open up a dam, or you were to flood an area, or you were to explode something. But let's do the dam one, and the dam opens and floods a small Pennsylvanian town, killing 6,000 people in Pennsylvania. The US government would be forced to respond. Now, the terrifying thing about cyber warfare is it's very hard to pick who did it, because it could just be a very talented person living in the Central African Republic, or it could be the Russian government. So if you were, let's say, China, you could quite easily say, oh, it was a Mexican, Mexicans did it. And then if you're an election year on a swing state that really is important like Pennsylvania, you might be forced to respond very, very harshly. So you might go to war with someone, that is not even responsible for that action, and wear down your troops and your morale and your forces on something that costs the Chinese, very, very little. You can effectively, going back to war books and stuff, it's almost the plot of Sum of All Fears that, this terrorist convinces the Americans and the Russians to almost nuke each other. the Chinese could do a very similar thing. Their cyber warfare capabilities are far above from what we're understanding. They're far above what we thought they were, and they are expanding quickly. And it's a front that, it's very hard to blame. When the power cuts in New York, even if it's cut for an hour, 20 people will die just because of, they'll fall off something, they'll walk into something. Imagine that on a very large scale and the panic and pandemonium. I mean, you can cut the lights out at a shop and people lose their minds, let alone if you cut it to an entire city or give out a fake nuclear warfare alert or do something like that, which would just cause pandemonium and force people to just turn on each other. And that's very, very simple things to do for the Chinese. It's the one that really worries me. They didn't experiment with, the CIA didn't experiment where they dropped 60 USBs into the CIA car park. And out of those 60, 34 of those USBs were plugged into network computers, which means people picked them up and went, oh, I wonder who this is, clicked it in, and now whatever software was on that USB is now on the US system. That's terrifying because it means that how many times you picked up a USB and now the Chinese could be putting software in the system. It could be the Russians doing it. There's a whole bunch of things that are just terrifying when it comes to cyber warfare.
That's why we don't utilize USBs for like government computers, because that exact reason. Like it actually has to be government approved, and it actually you have to receive it physically from somebody. If you just pick up a USB on the ground, you're supposed to turn it into your nearest security office and actually have somebody take a look at it. So, actually, before we close
because of that experiment, it went wrong.
Absolutely. So before we close up shop, actually, why don't you go ahead and just let everybody know where they can find you, and if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with anybody, go ahead.
So you can find the Redline on Spotify and Apple Music and Podcast Addict and Podbean and pretty much everywhere. I know we're getting on YouTube soon. I was talking to my staff today about it. We're on all the major platforms. And if you want to learn about, the show is designed to be that you start off basic and you can learn the basics. So let's say the Libyan civil war, where we start with, a guy just talking about how it got there, who the combatants are, what's going on. And we end with the Assistant Secretary, Secretary of State, who comes in and actually gives you on what the US position is, why they're going there. We have the real experts coming in and chatting. So you can start with the kind of, a very easy way of doing it and walk out sounding very smart for a dinner party because you've listened to the actual, the president of that country going, yeah, obviously, we've done this and this is why we're doing this because this will affect our understandings in Chad and da-da-da-da-da-da. If you want to take a crash course on a country or a war or a situation, it's a good way to do it.
Fantastic. Well, Mike, I just wanted to say I appreciate you taking the time for us to kind of collaborate and just talk business. I know I'm going to be coming on your show to be talking about private military contractors, if I'm not mistaken.
Very excited for it. It's going to be a very interesting subject.
That's going to be a good subject, actually, because having been in Iraq, I actually had some experience with these gentlemen, but I'll just save that for the entire show. Is there anything else you want to say before we close out?
No, just say thanks for having me on, and hopefully we learned some stuff, and it was pretty gnarly topics, and as you open up the show with the perfect thing that nothing is ever black and white. It's always a million shades of gray, and a lot of the time people are focusing on the what. This bomb went off here, but they don't understand the why of going, that bomb went off because of this. And I think if we look at, a million shades of gray and the whats and the whys, I think we can get a far better idea on what's going on in the world.
Like I always tell everybody, I always tell all my listeners and whatnot, always ask questions. Don't look to me as being the main source of information. I just put out what I've heard, who said it, and here's what I think about it. I don't say anything unless I am 100% sure on something. I very rarely will say, well, this is what I say is the word of God, essentially. I never say that unless I am a 100% sure and I know exactly what I'm talking about. And I that's why I try to be very careful about what I say. But I always tell people, even if you don't believe what I say, do some research. Don't go to one resource. Go to multiple resources. If you see a website, check the person that wrote that website. Check their bias. For all you know, you could be tuning into somebody that has extreme right-wing or extreme left-wing bias, but without any real information in there. That's the thing I usually tell my listeners, and hopefully more listeners continue to, ask those questions, because sometimes the simplest question can actually be the one that you need to ask people. And even if it's a really tough one, those are the questions that need asked and need to be answered, essentially. So, but anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank Michael for joining me on Depth of Perspective. And Michael, once again, thank you. I'll talk to you shortly after this. Thanks again, Michael.
No, it was an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, fantastic. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are rounds complete.